The Creamery wagon did not come on Monday. Marin Holt stood at the end of her lane with 2 cans of morning milk and watched the road shimmer. Nothing moved on it but heat. By noon, the milk in her neighbors' spring houses had already begun to turn. By Wednesday, the whole valley knew the wagon was not coming back for weeks. That was the week the widow they had left to build alone unbarred the door of her dead husband's ice house. She was 31 that summer, auburn hair pinned in a braided bun, freckles darkened by field sun, forearms hard from a year of work no one had shared. She wore a cream blouse with the sleeves rolled and a brown apron stiff with sawdust. When Johanna Breke came up the lane with an empty can and a sick child at home, Marin did not make her ask twice. She swung the north door open on its leather hinges. Cold air rolled out over the doorsill and turned to fog in the heat. Behind her, stacked to the rafters, sat the winter. Blocks of pond ice, blue-white and sweating, bedded in pale sawdust like eggs in bran. Marin lifted a frost-beaded tin can from the cooling trough with both hands and passed it into the light. It kept, Johanna said. She held the can against her chest as if it might vanish. All this time it kept. Ice doesn't care what month it is, Marin said. It only cares how it's packed. That is the whole lesson of this story, told at the door where the valley finally learned it. Cold is a crop. You harvest it in January and you spend it in August, and the family that puts up cold in winter owns something in summer that money cannot buy on short notice. The people of Sorrel Creek could have learned that a year earlier from the man who first drew the building on the back of a feed bill. Instead, they buried him, pitied his widow, and priced his half-built folly at nothing. To understand what stood behind that door and why 40 people would one day stand on a frozen pond because of it, you have to go back to the summer before. Back to when the walls stood only shoulder high, and Elias Holt was still alive. The Holt place sat on 80 acres of cleared ground in western Minnesota, a mile above the pond that gave Sorrel Creek its water and its name. Elias had taken the land for the pond as much as the soil. He was a careful man, slow to spend and slow to speak, and he had married a careful woman. Between them, they ran 9 milk cows, a garden, a flock of hens, and one daughter, Greta, who was 9 years old and could already strip a cow dry faster than most hired men. Their money came from milk. Twice a day it came warm out of the cows, and twice a day it began to die. Warm milk sours in hours. Cool milk keeps for days. Every dairy family in the valley fought that arithmetic with a spring house, a stone box built over cold ground water, and in an ordinary June a spring house was enough. The Creamery in Dunmore sent its wagon up the valley road each morning, collected the cans, and paid cash money when the month closed. Cash was rare in that country. The milk check was the difference between buying shoes and cutting last year's leather smaller for growing feet. The spring Elias signed the new contract, the Creamery changed its terms. Mr. Dahl, the Creamery's agent, read them out on the Holt's porch. Milk would be graded at the platform. Sweet milk, full price. Milk on the turn, half price. Soured milk, refused outright, and 3 refusals in a season would end the contract for good. Your spring house runs warm by July, Dahl said. He was not unkind about it. He was a man reading numbers off a page. Creek drops, ground warms, and your milk rides 2 hours in my wagon before it ever reaches ice. You want full grade in August, you need your milk standing at 50 degrees before my man lifts it. That means ice, Elias, real ice, all summer. Elias walked the agent back to his buggy and stood a long time at the pond afterward. Then he came in to supper and told Marin he meant to build an ice house. She had known the word all her life without ever thinking about the thing. Ice houses belonged to towns, to butchers and hotels and the creamery itself. But the principle, Elias explained, drawing on the back of the feed bill, was farm-sized and old as settlement. You cut ice from your own pond in the coldest weeks of winter. When it grew more than a foot thick, you stacked it tight in a building made for nothing else. You packed every gap, every wall, every top surface with a thick blanket of dry sawdust, because sawdust trapped dead air, and dead air was the poorest carrier of heat God ever made. Done right, a farmer spent perhaps 2 weeks of winter labor and kept ice into September. Half of it melts anyway, he admitted. You plan for that. You cut twice what you think you need. The half that lives through August is worth more than the whole pond in January. Marin asked what it would cost. That was her half of every decision, and Elias never resented it. Lumber for double walls, hinges, nails, 2 weeks of a neighbor's team for hauling. Most of one winter's savings spent on a building that produced nothing, grew nothing, and fed nothing. A building whose entire purpose was to slow down time. The contract dies without it, Elias said, and Marin. A thing that keeps milk, keeps butter, keeps meat. A building like that is never full of only one family's trouble. She would remember that sentence for the rest of her life. At the time she only nodded and did the sums again by lamplight and agreed. The valley did not agree. Word traveled, as it does, from the lumber order at Dunmore. Gunner Vick, who farmed the largest place on the creek and spoke as if that settled every question, summed up the general opinion at the church steps. A spring house had been good enough for his father. Ice was for town men who sold cold by the pound. Elias Holt was spending shoe money on a monument to worry. He's digging his own root cellar in the sky, Vic said, and got his laugh. It mattered more than laughing usually matters. In that country, a man raised a building with his neighbors' backs. A barn went up in a day because 30 men came to lift it. When Elias let it be known he would be raising walls in June, the answers came back slow and thin. Busy that week. Hay to get in. It was never a refusal outright. It was the kind of refusal that leaves no one to blame. So Elias built alone, with Marin studying posts and Greta hauling water, and the walls rose shoulder high by the middle of June. What he lacked was the last of the lumber, the long pine for the plates and rafters. Sawnboards cost cash he no longer had. But a stand of white pine grew on the far shore of the pond, on land open for the taking of deadfall, and Elias was a careful man with an uncareful hope in him. He felled what he needed, lashed the logs into a raft, and set out to swim and pole them across on a bright Saturday morning. The wind came up out of the southwest at mid-morning. It was not a storm. It was only wind, the ordinary kind, and it worked the raft apart one lashing at a time in the middle of the deepest water. Elias Holt could shoe a horse, splice a rope, and figure interest in his head, but he had grown up on prairie without a pond to his name, and he could not swim. Greta saw it from the garden. By the time Marin reached the shore, there was nothing on the water but scattered logs, drifting slow, all of them pointing different directions. The valley came then. They came with dragging hooks and lanterns, with covered dishes and scripture, with every kindness that costs a day. They buried him in the churchyard at Dunmore, and Vic himself, hat in his hands, called him a good neighbor taken too soon. For 1 week, the Holt kitchen was never empty. Then the hay came ripe, and the valley went home to its own work, and the kindness that costs more than a day never arrived at all. What remained on the rise above the pond was a rectangle of shoulder-high walls open to the sky, with fireweed already growing in the doorway. People passing on the pond road learned not to look at it. Dead man's folly, finished by no one, gathering rain. Inside the house, a widow sat down with a feed bill covered in her husband's pencil marks and a contract with her husband's name on it, and began to read. Widowhood in that country was an account that never balanced. Marin learned its arithmetic the first month. The cows still gave twice a day. The hens still wanted feed, the garden still wanted weeding, and now every task that had been split 2 ways landed on one pair of hands. She rose before 4 and finished after 9, and the work was not the frightening part. The frightening part was the ledger. She kept it the second Sunday of September at the kitchen table, with Greta asleep and a lamp trimmed low. Cash on hand after the funeral, the lumber, and the summer, $11 and change. Owed to the store at Dunmore, nearly 9. Income until spring, the milk check, and nothing else. She wrote the numbers twice, hoping they would improve on acquaintance. They did not. The milk check had a rope around its neck, and the rope was the contract. Mr. Dahl drove out himself in October to say so, which was more courtesy than the paper required. He sat in the kitchen with his hat on his knee and his eyes anywhere but the window, because the window showed the walls. "I carried you at full grade through August out of respect," he said. "I can't carry anybody through next summer." The board graded every can on the platform this year. Yours turned twice in the July heat. Under the new terms, that's 2 refusals, and a third ends it. He turned his hat a quarter turn. A widow alone, no cold storage. The board will want the contract moved to a farm that can hold grade. I'd rather it stayed here. I'm telling you plain so you have the winter to decide. Decide what? Marin asked. Sell the cows in spring and keep chickens, or finish what Elias started. He said it flat, like the terms he read off pages. There's no third road that keeps this farm. After he left, Marin stood at the window a long time. The walls on the rise had gone gray already. Rain had stood in the footings and warped one course. Fireweed had gone to seed in the doorway, and the seed drifted over the sill like the first snow of the building's death. She put on Elias's coat and walked up. She had helped raise those walls, so she knew them, but she had never read the plan behind them. That evening, she spread the feed bill on the table, and the other papers that went with it, a county extension circular on farm ice houses, worn soft at the folds, and a page of Elias's own figures. Reading a dead man's plans is a slow conversation. She read all winter's worth in a week, and what she found changed her opinion of her husband from a careful man to a patient genius. Nothing about the building was accidental. He had set it on the rise, not for the view, but because ice dies from the bottom first. Meltwater is warmer than ice, and if it pools under the stack, it eats the stack from below. The rise gave fall for drainage, and his floor plan showed it, a sloped bed of gravel and cedar poles, so every drop of melt ran through and away without ever standing. The door faced north, where the sun never struck. The walls were doubled, a foot of clear space between the outer boards and the inner, and that space was to be tamped full of dry sawdust. The circular gave the reason in one sentence Marin copied into her own book. Heat does not walk through still air, it must be carried, and sawdust chops the air into cells too small to carry it. A foot of packed sawdust in a wall did more against July than a foot of solid oak. Up under the peak, he had drawn a ventilator, a slatted cupola. That had puzzled her until the circular explained it. The building had to breathe above the ice. Warm, damp air rising off the stack had to escape, or it would hang under the roof and sweat and drip and rot the sawdust. Cold storage was not sealing a box. It was managing a slow river of air and water so that both moved only where you chose. And in the margin, in pencil, Elias had done the sum that mattered. The pond ice would run better than a foot thick by late January. Cut blocks 18 inches by 24 inches through 12 to 14 inches of black ice. Each one close enough to 200 pounds for the ledger. 14 tons would see their own dairy through September, allowing for the half that always melts. But the building as drawn would hold better than 25 tons across 2 bays, with the second bay carrying its own trough for cooling cans. Beside the second bay he had written 4 words, "Room costs only sawdust." Marin sat back from the table. 9 cows did not need 2 bays. One family's butter did not need 25 tons. Elias had never said it aloud, but the pencil said it. He had been building for more milk than theirs from the first line he drew. She banked the stove and made the decision the same night, and it is worth being honest about what the decision was made of. It was not vision. It was not, that autumn, any dream of holding the valley's milk. It was a contract with a rope on it, a ledger that would not balance, a daughter who needed shoes, and a building already half paid for standing dead in the weather. Finishing it was simply the only road that kept the farm. The vision came later, and it came from the pencil marks, not from her. She would always say so, even when the valley no longer believed her. What she needed was lumber for the plates and rafters, sawdust by the wagon load, and ice tools she did not own. What she had was $11, a milk check under threat. And one commodity the valley had given her in abundance, its guilty conscience. She spent the guilt carefully, like the cash it was. At the mill in Dunmore, she asked the sawyer not for boards, but for slabwood and mill ends, the off-cut pine that burned in every stove in town, and for the sweepings of his saw pit. Sawdust was refused to him. He was hauling it to a burn pile at his own expense. She offered to clear it wagon by wagon all winter, and he agreed so fast she understood she could have asked for more. The long timber she could not beg, so she traded for it. The Sorensen place across the pond had lost its fences in a wet spring, and Lars Sorensen had more standing timber than time. Marin offered a season of Greta's egg money and her own hands at his spring fencing, in exchange for 6 pines felled and hauled around the shore road by his team, not across the water. She said that part with her eyes level, and Lars, who had helped drag the pond in June, looked away and agreed to haul them the long road himself. The raising she asked for straight out, once, at church in November. She stood at the steps where Vic had gotten his laugh and asked for 2 days of the valley's backs to set plates and rafters on standing walls, with dinner provided. It was a small ask by the customs of that country. A barn asked 30 men. This asked 8. She got 3. Lawrence Sorensen came and brought his son Nils, 16 and silent and strong as a stump puller. And old Pastor Halfston came, who could hold a board level but not much more. The rest of the valley had hay in, corn cribbed, and hogs already butchered, and it was busy that week all the same. Gunnar Vik drove past twice while the rafters went up, slowing his team both times, not stopping either time. "Let him look," said Lars, "on the ridge board." "He's welcome to," Marin said. "Looking is free," she said it lightly. But she wrote the names of the three who came on the first page of her book, the same book with the circular sentence about still air, and she drew a line under them. It was not bitterness. It was bookkeeping. In a country where cash was scarce, she had begun to understand that labor was the real currency, and that debts of labor, unlike debts of feeling, could be written down, remembered exactly, and one day called. By the first hard freeze, the building stood roofed and tight, double walls tamped full of mill sawdust, gravel floor sloped and true, north door hung on strap hinges, cupola slatted against birds. It stood on the rise like a granary with no windows, and it held exactly nothing. An ice house without ice is only a promise made of pine. The pond would keep its side of the bargain by the end of January. What the promise needed now was a foot of black ice, a set of tools she still did not own, and someone fool enough or poor enough to cut 14 tons of frozen pond into 200-pound blocks alone in the coldest fortnight of a Minnesota winter. The valley was right about one thing. It was no work for a widow. It was work for a crew, and she did not have one. Between the roofing and the harvest lay 6 weeks of waiting for cold, and Maren spent them the only profitable way a person can spend waiting, in study. If the pond was going to be her college, she meant to arrive having done the reading. She went to school in Dunmore, at the two places in town that lived by cold. The Creamery ran a brick ice vault behind the platform, and Doll, who had begun to take a bookmaker's interest in the Widow's Project, walked her through it on a gray November Tuesday. She came with questions ruled out in her book beforehand, and the vault keeper, a slow, careful Norwegian named Amund, answered them with the pleasure of a craftsman finally asked. How did they fight the melt where the stack met the floor? Cedar rails and a live drain, same as her circular, and he showed her the drain's trap, a bend of pipe that stayed full of water so cold air could not pour out the hole all summer like grain from a cut sack. She drew it. It cost her 2 elbows of stovepipe to copy at home, and it saved her, over the years, more ice than any single trick she owned. What ruined ice houses? She asked him. Not summer, Amund said. Pride and shortcuts. Stacks laid loose to save a day's fitting. Sawdust reused wet from last year because dry cost hauling. Doors opened all hours because rules feel foolish in April when the chamber is full and the weather is kind. Every dead ice house he had ever seen was killed in the easy months. Her second school was Price's cellar, and Price's tongue, which taught more than he knew he was teaching. Waiting on his counter Saturdays, she learned the trade's economics sideways. What town households paid for ice by the season ticket, what the hotel paid, what the saloon paid, why the price doubled in a drought and tripled when the fever ran, because fear buys cold faster than heat does. She wrote the numbers small in the back pages. She was not planning a business. She was learning the shape of a market the same way she had learned the shape of a drain. Because it lay along the road she was walking, and nothing along that road was going to pass unrecorded into the dark. The valley, meanwhile, was conducting its own study of her, and the findings were mixed. A widow hauling mill sweepings by the wagon load made a picture, and the picture traveled. Some of the versions were kind. Most priced her folly at her husband's doubled for stubbornness. The mildest school held that grief needed something to do with its hands, and a harmless shed was cheaper than madness. And the winter would cure her of the whole notion when the real work of it arrived. The unkindest version reached her, as the unkindest versions do, through Greta, who came home from the school term with her knuckles skinned and her braid half out, and a silence that took 2 days to open. A boy had recited his father's judgment at the noon recess, the widow Holt was cracked as spring ice, and the county would have the farm by summer. The recitation had cost him a tooth, which Greta reported without repentance, chin set exactly like her father's. Marin doctored the knuckles and delivered no sermon on fighting. What she said instead, wrapping the hand, became one of the sentences the family kept. People price what they can see, she said. All they can see of us is a shed with no windows and a woman hauling sawdust. The proof's asleep under the pond, and it won't wake till July. You can't argue a crop up out of the ground in November, Greta. You can only plant it right and let the season do the talking. Our season's just further off than most. That's all a system is, girl. Bet the season pays. And if it doesn't pay, then we'll be poor with sore backs instead of poor with soft ones, Marin said. It was never a wide choice. The building got its own first test that winter before any ice did, and passed it in a manner that settled Marin's last doubts about the pencil. The first blizzard came down the second week of December. 2 days of white wind that put drifts to the eaves of every structure on the place. The barn, 40 years old and settled, moaned and leaked snow at every joint. The ice house, 1 season old, sat in the storm like a stone in a river. She walked its inside with a lamp on the second night. Between stock checks, and the flames stood upright in the double-walled dark while the county roared outside, and the boards did not so much as tick. Dead air, holding the same still cells that would keep July out were keeping December out, indifferent as arithmetic to which direction the heat was trying to travel. She stood in the cold quiet with the lamp, understanding her husband's building one full turn deeper. This was no shed. It was a truce with the weather, signed in sawdust, good in both directions. And it would hold for whoever kept its terms and for no one else. The last piece of that winter's schooling was the one she never planned, and it came, like most of her curriculum, from the ledger. Doing the year's accounts at Christmas, she noticed what the trade in favors had quietly become. The sawyer's refuse hauled, a fence line pledged, egg money assigned, tools borrowed against summer ice. 3 names and a ruled line in the front of the book. Not $1 had changed hands in any of it, and yet every party stood better than cash could have left them, because each had traded a surplus for a scarcity. She sat looking at the page a long time. Cash the valley barely had. Surpluses it had everywhere, timber here, sawdust there, strong sons on one farm and empty cribs on the next. And no instrument in the county for trading them except memory and grudge. A book could be that instrument. A book with fair columns, kept by somebody the parties trusted, could move value around a township all winter without a coin in sight. She wrote the thought down and dated it, not because she had plans for it, but because it had the feel of the drain trap drawing, a thing copied from somewhere ahead of her on the road. When the fever summer came and the valley stood at her door with no cash worth the name, she did not have to invent the answer in a crisis. It was already in the book, waiting like everything else she ever relied on, planted one season and harvested another. The tools came from the butcher at Dunmore, and they came with a lesson attached. Aldous Price cut and sold ice every winter for his own cellar, and he owned what a harvest needed: the long ice saw with its coarse teeth, the marking plow, the breaker bar, the iron tongs, and a pair of creepers, the spiked plates that strapped to boot soles and kept a body upright on wet ice. He lent the lot for a promise of 200 pounds of ice in July, delivered cold to his cellar door. Borrowed tools cut the same as owned ones, he said, loading them in her wagon. But hear me on the order of the work, because the order is what keeps you alive. Test before you trust. Clear before you mark. Mark before you cut. And never, not once, stand on the piece you're cutting free. He taught her to read ice like a buyer reads a horse. Black ice, clear and dark as bottled glass, was the strong ice frozen slow from still water. White ice, frozen from slush and snow, was half air and half a lie, and carried a third of the weight at the same thickness. He showed her how to cut a test hole with an auger every 20 paces and measure with a notched stick. A foot of black ice would hold a team and sledge. She was to walk the whole field of her harvest and prove it, every rod of it, before the first mark was plowed. Elias asked me the same questions in October, Price said, quietly, at the end. I'd have lent him the same iron. I'm sorry it's you, missus, but the ice won't know the difference. The cold that January came down hard and stayed, which was misery for stock and mercy for the harvest. By the third week, the auger showed 14 inches of clear dark ice off the north shore, over the deep water. Over the deep water. Marin had known from the first reading of the circular that the best ice grew where the pond was deepest and stillest, and the deepest water was where the raft had come apart in June. There was no cutting around that fact. There was only walking onto it. She went out the first morning in the blue dark before 6, with Greta ordered to the kitchen window with instructions and a horn. If the ice broke, Greta was not to come out. She was to blow the horn for the Sørensens and keep blowing. Children in that country grew up on such instructions, the calm grammar of catastrophe, and Greta took hers with a nod and a jaw set exactly like her father's. First the snow. A fresh fall lay 4 inches deep on the field she meant to cut, and it had to come off, because snow is a blanket. It kept the ground warm and the ice thin, and every day it lay there the ice beneath grew slower. She scraped it in lanes with the horse and a plank drag, and the bared black ice boomed and rang under the runners, long echoing cracks that Price had told her to expect. Sound ice talks, he said. It is the silent thaw ice that kills. Then, the marking. The ice plow was a heavy sled with a row of cutting teeth dragged in straight lines to score a grid into the surface, each square the size of the block wanted. She laid her grid off the plan in Elias's pencil, 18 inches by 24. The plow cut 3 inches deep on the first pass, deeper on the second. The grid, when the low sun came over the trees and lit it, looked like a great gray quilt stitched onto the pond, and for one breath she stood in the middle of it and could not swallow. Then the saw. There is no romance in sawing ice, and no one who has done it pretends otherwise. The saw was 5 feet of toothed steel with a wooden crossbar worked straight up and down through the scored line. And it took the whole body, legs planted wide, back straight, the stroke pulled from the shoulders and hips, because arms alone would be dead in an hour. The first cut took her 40 minutes. Water welled up gray in the kerf and froze to her mittens and beads. 12 strokes, rest, 12 strokes, rest. By the end of the first day she had opened 1 channel and freed 6 blocks, and her hands would not close around a spoon at supper. 14 tons was 140 blocks. At 6 blocks a day, the arithmetic was a sentence of death for the whole plan, and she did it that night in the ledger with her stiff hands and refused to write the conclusion. The second morning, Nils Sørensen was standing on the shore at first light with a pole hook over his shoulder and no explanation. He was 16, and he had watched his father look away from a widow's level eyes in November, and something in that had worked on him all winter the slow, patient work that shame does in the young. "Pa can spare me till thaw," was the whole of his speech that day. She did not refuse him, and she did not thank him past once, because he plainly could not have borne it. She fed him dinner and supper, and she wrote his days in the book. They fell into the order of work that the trade has used wherever winter is honest. She sawed the long cuts. Nils worked the breaker bar. A heavy iron chisel dropped along the scored cross lines, and the blocks cracked off the sheet clean along the score, the grid doing with geometry what no man could do with strength. Then, the floating. This was the part that had seemed like madness in the telling and turned out to be genius in the doing. You do not lift 200 pounds of ice from the water if you are wise. You open one straight channel from the cutting field to the shallows, and you float the blocks down it like barges, poled from behind, steered with the hook. Water carried what backs could not. Elias's pencil had drawn the channel straight to the foot of the rise, where the bank made a natural ramp. At the ramp stood the horse and a plank slide and the tongs. The tongs bit the block, the horse took the rope, and the block came surging up the wet planks with a sound like a whetstone the size of a door. Onto the sledge, up the rise, into the north doorway. Nils stacked, Maren packed. And here the circular's last lessons came due, because stacking ice is its own trade. The blocks went in tight, square, and touching, every course level as a mason's, because a stack of ice wants to be one single block of ice. Packed solid, it presented the summer with the least surface it could, and a ton of ice in one mass outlives a ton of ice in scattered pieces by months. But the stack must never touch the walls. A foot of clear space stayed open all around, and into that space went sawdust, rammed down hard with a tamping pole, a foot of it, wall to ice. All the sides. Sawdust below on the cedar floor, sawdust rammed in every course, and at the last, 2 feet of sawdust blanketing the top like soil on a grave. Greta kept the tally. Every block that passed the doorsill got a stroke of her pencil, and every evening she announced the count at supper with the gravity of a bank examiner. It became the family liturgy of that winter. 12 blocks, 20 on the best day, with the channel open and the weather holding, 31. They cut for 11 days. The cold held for 9 of them, the last 2 ran soft and south windy, and Maren, hearing Price's voice about silent ice, moved the cutting field to the shallower east lobe and gave up the last rank of the deep water grid rather than stand on it 1 hour past its honesty. It cost her 8 blocks. She counted the cost out loud to Nils so he would learn the accounting behind the caution. 8 blocks is a week of August, she said. A wet coat is a day. A body under the ice is everything, forever. Cheapest thing on this pond is the ice we walk away from. On the 12th morning, the tally in Greta's book stood at 182 blocks. Better than 18 tons, by Elias's figures, bedded, packed, and blanketed. 4 tons over the plan, because the plan had said cut twice your need, and Maren had learned to trust the plan past the point of comfort. The second bay stood a third full, exactly as the pencil had always intended. They closed the north door on it the 3rd week of February. Maren set the bar in its brackets and stood a moment with her mitten flat on the boards. Inside, in the dark, in the still air chopped too fine to carry heat, winter itself lay folded and waiting. 18 tons of January addressed and posted to August. Gunnar Vic's opinion arrived by the usual post, second-hand through the store at Dunmore. A woman had frostbit her face, cutting ice a rich man would sell her for $1 a hundredweight come summer. and there was no fool like a poor fool. Marin heard it, finished her buying, and put the change in her purse. He prices the ice at what he'd pay in January, she told Greta on the ride home. Nobody buys a well in a rainstorm. Remember what things cost in the season you'll need them, not the season you're standing in. Greta wrote it down. She had started her own book by then, copying her mother's habit stroke for stroke, and what she chose to copy would turn out in the end to matter to the whole valley. But that came later. First came the spring, the proof nobody watched, and then the summer that stopped the wagon. Spring came, the cows freshened, and the quiet proof began. The kind no one watches because nothing goes wrong. The system, in use, was simplicity itself, and its simplicity was the whole art. Inside the north door, in the second bay, stood the cooling trough Elias had drawn, a long tarred box half filled with water. Each morning Marin chipped ice from the working face of the stack, never opening more of the sawdust blanket than the day's need, and dropped it in the trough. The milk cans went into the ice water to their shoulders within minutes of milking. Water, the circular said, steals heat 40 times faster than air. Milk that would take half a night to cool in a spring house came down below 60 degrees in the trough before breakfast was cleared. By the time the Creamery wagon reached her lane at 8, the Holt cans were the coldest on the route, and the driver learned to stack them at the center of the load where they cooled their neighbors. Grading day at the platform told the tale in numbers. Full grade in May, when everyone made full grade. Full grade through June. Then July came in hot and rainless, the creek dropped, the spring houses climbed toward 70, and the platform began refusing cans from farms that had milked the same land for 20 years. The Holt milk came in at 50 degrees and sweet as morning every day all month. Mr. Dahl drove out again in August, this time looking straight at the building on the rise. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I made you a widow's speech in October. You've got the best graded milk on the north route, and I know exactly one other farm-holding grade this summer, and it's a Creamery Director's." He paused at his buggy. "What did the ice cost you to put up, all told? Tools and hauling and your own labor counted fair?" Marin had the figure to the nickel, because of course she did. He whistled at it, low. "The board pays a bonus for certified cold storage starting next season. It won't make you rich. It'll make you the first woman in the county book of certified suppliers." He climbed up, then said the thing he had really driven out to say. "Some of your neighbors asked me this month what refused milk fetches. The answer is, nothing, missus. It fetches nothing. There's going to be a certain amount of thinking done in this valley by Christmas, and it'll be done facing your hill." The other proof of that first summer rode to town under sawdust. In July she paid the butcher his 200 pounds, and the delivery taught her the last trade secret she needed, which was that ice travels. Packed in a wagon box between layers of sawdust and covered with a wet canvas, blocks crossed the 8 miles to Dunmore on a July noon and lost barely 10 pounds doing it. Cold was not chained to the building. Cold could be shipped, like eggs, like butter, like anything else a farm made. She wrote that in the book, too. Price turned the blocks in his hands at the cellar door like a man weighing coin. "Clean, square, and dry," he said. "You could sell this in town all summer, and I'd have competition for the first time in 9 years. Are you going to?" "I'm going to keep my milk contract," Marin said. "The rest of it isn't a business. It's a margin." "Margins," said the butcher, "are what businesses are made of. You'll see." There was a second trade hiding inside the first that summer, and it found her through a failure, as most of her education did. Butter, every dairy wife in the valley churned, and every one of them fought the same July war. Cream must ripen cool and churn cool near 60 degrees, and butter must set up cold or it will not gather, will not work free of its milk, and will not keep. In a hot spring house the churning ran to noon, and the butter came greasy and pale and went rancid on the road to town. Summer butter from that country sold at half the winter price and deserved it, and the storekeeper's face when a farm wife set her crock on his counter in August was its own commodity report. Marin assumed the trough had won her that war along with the milk war, and in the first week of July she lost a whole churning to the assumption. She had iced the cream hard, straight off the separator pan, cold as the trough could make it, and churned it cold, and the churn ran 2 hours and gave her nothing but stiff flecks in a can of chilled cream that would not gather into butter at all. She took the failure to the person in the county who had churned longest, which was old Mrs. Halfston, the pastor's mother, 90 and blind and sharper about dairy than a creamery chemist. The old woman laughed her dry laugh and set her straight in one sentence. Cream is not milk. Milk you want as cold as water can make it, the coldest can wins. Cream must ripen a day at cellar cool to sour just to the edge, and go to the churn at 60, not 45, for the butter will not come from sweet frozen cream any more than bread will rise in an icebox. Cold's a tool, girl, not a religion, the old woman said. Every food's got its own right temperature, and the whole craft is knowing which. Ice gives you the choosing. It don't do the knowing. Marin wrote that down word for word, and it became the second sentence of her system, the corrective the first one needed. The trough gave her every temperature from pond cold to cellar cool all summer at will, which no springhouse and no cellar in the county could say. Once the knowing was added to the choosing, the butter came golden and hard and sweet. 20 minutes in the churn on the hottest morning of the year, and it went to town packed in an ice chip box of her own contriving and reached Price's counter as firm as Christmas. Price weighed the first delivery in his hands, pressed it, smelled it, and looked up with the expression of a man watching a market being born on his own scale. Winter butter in August, he said. I'll take every pound at winter price, and there's 3 households in this town will bid over that once word walks around. What else keeps in that building of yours, missus? Think on it as a list, because every line of it sells at August prices. The list, as the summer taught it to her, ran longer than she had guessed. Eggs held weeks in the cool bay instead of days in a hot pantry. The garden's first lettuces and berries, wilted by 9 in any July kitchen, came crisp to Sunday tables and were spoken of. A quarter of beef Price sent up on trial hung sweet in the cold chamber for 12 days in high summer, a thing simply impossible anywhere else north of his own cellar, and the trial became a standing trade, his overflow against her space, priced in his iron and his July fees. None of it was a fortune. All of it together, entered fairly, came to more than the milk bonus, and she noticed the proportion and thought about it in her level way. The building had been built to save one contract. Unasked, it had begun to grow sidelines the contract never imagined, because cold was not a product. Cold was a condition, and every perishable thing in the county wanted it, and wants that broad do not stay private. The margin was where the future lived. She could not yet see the shape of it, but she had learned to feel a plan ripening in the dark ahead of her. And she banked toward it the same way she banked sawdust more than the year needed, on principle. The valley women came around before the valley men did, And they came the practical way, one problem at a time, over fences and after church. How did she keep the butter so hard? What did she do for the cream in this heat? Could a body bring a crock up, just the once, with company coming and the pudding wanting to set? Marin said yes to every once, and wrote every once in the book, and the onces became a small, quiet traffic of women up the rise all that first summer, crocks and cans and berry pails in the cool bay, nothing agreed, nothing priced, everything remembered. Her neighbor Ella Round, whose husband had been busy the week of the raising, and every week since, stood in the doorway one August evening, looking at the stacked winter while her cream cooled, and said what all of them had been circling. "The men keep saying, 'It wouldn't answer,' she said. 'It answers everything we ask it, near as I can tell.' What is it they mean, Marin, when they say it wouldn't answer?" "They mean it wasn't theirs," Marin said, mildly, handing down the crock. "It's a common ailment. I had a dose of it myself when Elias first drew the thing. Somebody else's idea always looks like a shed with no windows. Give them time. Ideas change owners easier than land does." She was not bitter about the men that summer, and the record ought to say so, because the easy telling makes her a prophet scorned and the valley a pack of fools, and neither was true. The men were running the same arithmetic she ran, with the numbers they had. A spring house had answered for 40 years. Cash was scarce, winters were long. And a fortnight of ice work stood between any of them and her result, a fortnight none could spare on a widow's say-so. They were not stupid. They were solvent, which is a condition that teaches slowly. The fever summer would furnish the missing numbers, and when it did, the same men would move faster than she had, because the proof would be standing on a hill in plain sight with their children's milk inside it. What the first summer proved to the one household that could read the whole ledger was narrower and deeper. The system paid, not handsomely, not yet, but soundly, at every point where it touched the world, milk, butter, eggs, meat, the town trade, the borrowed tools gone home with interest. $60 of building and 200 hours of ice had returned their cost inside one season and stood ready to return it again free for a decade. And the return was not luck. It was the same few laws applied without holidays. Buy cold in January when it is free. Spend it in August when it is priceless. Guard it with still air and running drains. Keep the right temperature for the right thing. Write everything down. At the bottom of that first summer's accounting, Marin ruled a double line, the bookkeeper's amen, and under it she wrote the family's winter orders, sawdust to haul, tools to return. A fence pledge to work off at the Sorensen place, and one line that was not an order but had the grammar of one, copied forward from a dead man's feed bill into her own running hand, where it would wait through the snow for the summer that finally understood it. Room costs only sawdust. What stood in the margin as the first summer closed was this. The stack had gone in at 18 tons. Melt had taken its tithe all season, faster in July, slower behind every fresh tamping of sawdust, and the loss ran close to what Elias's pencil had promised. Something near a third gone by September, with a mass holding hard at the center. 9 cows and 1 butter trade had drawn barely 5 tons of that. When she barred the door as September closed, there was ice enough left to have carried another farm through the same season, and it had cost her, past the first winter's cutting, almost nothing but attention. Attention was the tax the system levied, and she paid it like a religion. The door opened once a day, mornings, when the outside air was coolest and never stood open while she worked, every opening spilled the chambers cold and brought a pound of melt. The drain got walked and cleared weekly, because a plugged drain meant standing water, and standing water was the stack's slow murderer. The sawdust blanket got raked level and topped after every chipping. The cupola slats got cleared of wasp nests, 10 minutes a day, every day, without fail. Systems do not die of storms, she told Greta. They die of Tuesdays, of the one small maintenance skipped 40 times. That winter, the second winter, the cutting went different, and the difference measured something. Nils came back the first cold week without being asked. Lars came 3 days with his team when the hauling peaked. Price lent the tools for the same July fee and drove out once just to watch the channel work. Even so, the valley's official opinion held its ground. An ice house was a widow's oddity that had happened to pay, the exception that proved nothing. Vic put a new spring house on his place that fall, dug deeper. At twice the cost of Marin's whole building, and the valley called it prudence. She brought the store back to 20 tons that January, filled the second bay to the rafters, and told herself it was because the cutting had gone easy and sawdust was free. That was true, and it was not the reason. And she knew it was not the reason. The reason was 4 words of pencil in a dead man's hand, the same 4 she had copied forward into her own book. She was 31 years old, the certified cold storage supplier of a valley that pitied her on Sundays, and she had begun, without ever saying it aloud, to build for more milk than hers. Then came the fever summer, and the valley found out what the margin was for. It arrived the first week of June as weather. The winter had run dry, the spring ran drier, and by the solstice the country stood in the kind of drought that farmers date other years by. Sorrel Creek fell to a chain of warm pools. The spring houses, those stone boxes of borrowed coolness, borrowed from ground that was no longer cool. And one by one they climbed through the 60s and gave up the fight before noon each day. Wells drew low and cloudy. Stock stood in the pond shallows all day and fouled them. Everything in the valley that had always been just cold enough stopped being cold at all. Then it arrived as sickness. It broke out first along the lower creek. In the households that drew drinking water nearest their own barnyards, and Dr. Kessler, riding up from Dunmore, named it typhoid and said the word quarantine on 6 gateposts. He was one man with 1 horse and a county of it. He told every kitchen the same 3 things. Boil every drop you drink. Scald every vessel. And feed the sick on milk, milk above all. It was the one food a burning gut could hold, and it must be sweet, clean, and cold, and he knew as well as they did that he was prescribing something the valley no longer possessed. And then it arrived as the small announcement that turned crisis into arithmetic. The Creamery's own hands took sick, 2 drivers and the platform man in 1 week. The board suspended the north route, wagons, collections, payments and all, until further notice. The notice was posted at the Dunmore store on a Saturday. By Monday morning on 30 farms, the milk came warm out of the cows into a world that suddenly had nowhere cold to put it. Twice each day the milk came, and twice each day it started its dying. The oldest arithmetic in dairy country, the one every family had solved with the creek and the wagon, stood suddenly unsolved from one end of Sorrel Creek to the other, except at the top of one rise behind one north door where 18 remaining tons of January sat in the dark, packed in still air. Keeping a promise made by a man 2 summers drowned. Marin Holt stood at the end of her lane that Monday with 2 cans of morning milk and watched the road shimmer. Nothing moved on it but heat. She stood there a long moment, doing sums in her head. Then she carried her cans back up the hill, put them in the trough, and opened her book to a clean page. The clean page was headed with one word, pledges, and it is worth stopping on that word, because everything that happened afterward grew out of it. She could have sold the ice for cash. Price had told her the town price $1 a hundredweight and climbing with the heat, and the arithmetic of 18 tons at famine prices would have cleared her debts and half the mortgage in one summer. She sat with that sum for the better part of an hour, and no honest telling of this story pretends the sum had no pull. Cash was shoes. Cash was safety. But she had spent 2 winters learning what the valley never counted, that cash was the rare currency here and labor the real one, and the ice-cutting fortnight was the bottleneck of the whole system. Alone, she and one borrowed boy could cut 20 tons. 6 farms' worth of hands could cut 100. The stack in the dark behind her was the last stack she could ever build alone, and it was already spoken for twice over if the whole valley came asking. Cash would spend the system down to nothing and leave her, next January, exactly where she began. One woman with a saw on 14 inches of frozen pond. There was a second reason, and she wrote it nowhere, but it steered the pen. A family that pays cash walks away square and owes nothing and belongs to nothing. A family that owes a January week of labor is bound to the pond, to the building, and to her all the dark months until the debt comes due. Coin settles. Work binds. She had been 3 years learning what it was to stand outside every binding in the valley, and she chose, with her eyes open, to become the thing they were bound to. So the page said pledges, and beneath it she ruled columns in her study ledger hand. Family, canned stored, by the day. Ice drawn, by the pound. And the price entered not in dollars, but in promised days on the January ice. One day pledged for each week of storage, the debt to be paid by an able worker or a team at the harvest when called. She hitched the wagon and drove the valley road that same afternoon, farm to farm, and made at every kitchen door the same short speech. She had cold storage standing 3/4 empty. Any family on Sorrel Creek could bring its milk and butter to her trough and her North Bay. Starting that evening, and no can would be refused for last summer or last November or anything else that lay behind them. The price was labor, pledged in writing, payable on the pond in January, and any household with fever in it paid nothing at all. The valley's answers that first day were the valley in miniature. Lars Sorensen signed before she finished talking. Johanna Brecky, whose husband Anders lay already burning in the back room, and whose 4 children drank milk like fields drink rain, stood at her door with her hands twisted in her apron, and asked what the pledge came to for a family that might have no strong back to send by January. Then you'll owe it the January after, Marin said. The book keeps. That's the whole point of a book, Johanna. It remembers, so we don't have to fight about it. Gunnar Vick stood in his fine doorway, looked at her a long moment, and declined. He said it courteously, which for Vick was a kind of convulsion. His new spring house was the deepest in the valley, his wife had her own methods, and he would not put his family's food under another farmer's lock. Begging her pardon on principle. Which principle is that? Marin asked. It came out before she could dress it. The one where Gunnar Vick owes no man, he said, nor woman. Then I hope the weather respects it, she said, and clicked to the horse. By dusk of the first day, 11 farms had signed the page. By week's end, it was 19, and the north bay of the ice house held the milk of a valley. The system that ran that summer deserves to be told in its working parts, because it was the working parts, not the sentiment, that kept the milk alive. Every farm's cans came marked, painted initials on the shoulder. And Greta lettered a tally slate that hung on the inside of the door, cans in and cans out, by family, by day. The trough took the morning milk of the nearest farms whole. The farther farms learned to cool at home in ice they hauled from her door, 20 pounds in a wash boiler with the cans set in, because a pound of ice spent in the first hour after milking saved 3 spent later. And Marin preached that gospel at every handoff until the whole valley could recite it. The door discipline that had been one widow's religion became public law. Drawing hours were morning and evening only, when the air stood coolest. One person worked the door, and it was Marin or it was Greta, and the door stood open the shortest time hands could make it. The working face of the stack stayed under its sawdust except for the one open seam of the day. She posted no rules on paper. She simply refused the door to anyone who came at noon, twice, both times loudly, and the valley learned the hours the old way. And the strangest part, the part the valley talked about for years, was how fast the building stopped being hers. Within a fortnight, Sorensen boys were walking the drain without being told. Women who came for milk stayed to tamp sawdust, because Marin tamped while she talked and handed the pole to whoever stood nearest. The path up the rise, 2 summers a scar of one family's grief, wore wide and hard as a market road. The place had a smell everyone came to know, wet pine and sawdust and cold stone water. The smell of the one room in the county where July had no jurisdiction. Johanna Brekke came every evening for her children's milk, and it was on the 9th or 10th evening, in the full furnace of the drought, that the scene the valley would remember happened, the one that found its way into every telling afterward. She came up the path with her empty can. Worn transparent with nursing Anders and hauling boiled water, and Marin swung the north door, and the cold rolled out and fogged in the amber light, and behind her the blue-white blocks stood ranked to the rafters in their pale bedding. Marin lifted the Brekke can from the trough, beaded and streaming, and set it in Johanna's arms, and Johanna stood holding it the way you hold a sleeping child. "It kept," she said. "All this time it kept." "Ice doesn't care what month it is," Marin said. "It only cares how it's packed." Johanna looked past her at the stack, and then at the doorframe, at the pine Lars had hauled the long road around the pond, and her face worked. "We should have raised these walls," she said, "all of us. It was 2 days' work, Marin. It would have cost us 2 days." "It would have," Marin said. There was nothing soft in it, and nothing cruel either. It was a fact, priced fairly, the coldest and most useful gift she ever gave the valley. Then she nodded at the slate. "Your Kirsten writes a fair hand. Send her up mornings if you can spare her. The book's getting past what 2 of us can keep." That was Marin Holt's whole style of mercy, and the valley came to know it. She never once said what she was owed from the years they left her alone. She only handed each of them, along with the cold milk, one clear look at the arithmetic, and then, before the shame could set and sour, a job. Kirsten Brekke came the next morning. By August, there were 5 children keeping tallies, hauling sawdust, and clearing the drain. A crew of the valley's own young bound into the working of the thing, each one learning the system from the inside, none of them thinking of it as her building it all. She noticed that, wrote it in her book, and underlined it once. A method one household keeps is a possession. A method the neighbor's children can run is an institution. If the pledges were the roots of what came later, that line was the trunk. The fever, all this while, was climbing the valley one well at a time, and the stack, drawn on now by 19 farms, in the hottest summer in the county's memory, was melting 3 times as fast as any summer before. Both of those lines on the ledger ran toward the same week of August, and Marin, who could read a ledger the way Price read ice, saw the crossing coming from a long way off. The melt arithmetic was simple and merciless, and she ran it every Sunday night. 18 tons had stood in the dark when the wagon stopped. A private summer drew 5 tons in a season. This summer, with 19 farms drawing and the door working double hours and the drought outside pressing on the walls like a hand, the stack was giving up better than a ton a week. The fever would not break before the September rains broke the heat, if it broke then. The ledger said the ice would run out 2 weeks before the weather did. She did 3 things about it, and the order she did them in was a lesson in itself, because she cut waste before she cut people. First, the building. She hauled 6 loads of fresh sawdust from the mill and thickened the top blanket to a full yard. She rigged a canvas fly over the south wall, the sun side, on poles, a cheap shade that dropped the outer boards from too hot to touch down to barely warm. She shifted all drawing to a single evening hour, 1 opening of the door instead of 2. Small things, each worth a few pounds a day, and a few pounds a day across a season was a family's milk. Second, the book. She began charging the ice itself against each family's page by the pound drawn against their pledge, so that cold stopped being water from a free well and became what it was, a stock in hand, finite, visible, running down. She chalked the remaining tonnage on the slate by the door every Monday next to the tally. Anyone who came for milk read the number. Nobody had to be lectured about waste after that. The number did the preaching. Third, the rule she prayed she would never need. Milk storage came first and would not be rationed. Ice for the sick came second and would not be rationed. Everything else, ice for butter making, for drinking water, for the plain animal comfort of cold in that furnace of a summer, stood third, and could be shut off by the book the day the slate said so. The setback, when it came from none of the dangers she had planned against. It came from kindness, which was the one force she had no ledger for. The 3rd week of July she went down 2 days with a summer grip, nothing like the fever, but enough to put her flat. The drawing hour ran on without her, Greta at the door, neighbors handing cans, everyone helpful. And a helpful man, never afterward named, did the natural thing, the springhouse thing, rather than chip from the one open seam. He pried up the sawdust blanket along the whole east face to get it clean ice faster, took what he came for, and left the face bare. In a springhouse, it would not have mattered. In hers, it was a wound. The east face wept all night and all the next day before Greta saw the drain running hard and knew something upstream of it was wrong. 2 days of open face cost them close to a week's ration. Worse, the melt had hollowed under a corner of the top course, and when Marin, still gray from her bed, climbed to inspect, the course shifted, and a block the weight of a man slid past her shoulder and burst on the floor bed like a dropped anvil. She stood very still for a while after that, hand on the cold wall. She called the drawing hour together that evening and did not scold. She did something that worked better and cost her more. She showed them. She walked the whole crowd, women, children, and the 3 men present, through the chamber in one slow file, and made them look at the bared face, the hollow, the burst block being shoveled up by the piece. "This building doesn't forgive good intentions," she said. "It doesn't know them from bad ones. It only knows open and shut, packed and bare, drained and standing. My husband learned its rules out of a county circular, and I learned them from his pencil, and now you'll learn them from me. Because come January, this is going to be your building too, all of yours. And a building like this dies of its owners faster than its weather." It was the first time she had said it aloud. Come January, your building too. She had not planned to say it. The sentence had simply grown ripe in her and dropped. She watched it land on the crowd in the amber evening, watched the idea take hold of them one face at a time, and wrote in the book that night that she was now bound to a promise she had never quite decided to make, which, she noted, was how Elias's pencil had bound her too, and perhaps how everything durable gets built, one promise ripening past its planner. After the East Face lesson, the Valley's care of the building turned from helpful to exact. She appointed door wardens from among the pledged families, one per evening, trained by her, answerable for the seam, the blanket, and the slate. Lars Sorensen forged a chipping gauge, a simple iron frame, so that no one could bear more face than the day's ration allowed. The children's tally crew got a new column, pounds drawn, and Kirsten Brekke, it turned out, could figure faster than most grown men, and caught 2 entry mistakes that would have shorted her own family's page. Systems die of Tuesdays. The Valley had begun, without any one morning of decision, to guard its Tuesdays in shifts, and still the chalked number walked down, Monday by Monday, and still the heat sat on the Valley like a lid, and in the last week of July the fever reached the head of the creek and walked in the one door in the Valley that had sworn it owed nothing to anybody. It was Nils who brought word, riding bareback at dusk. The sickness was in the Vic house. Vic's son had it, and the son's wife had it worse, and there was a baby in that house weaned onto cow's milk, and every can of milk in Gunnar Vic's deep new spring house had gone over sour in the heat 3 days running. Maren stood in her doorway, the horse blowing and stamping in the yard. And she was not proud of the first feeling that moved in her, and she never pretended to be. It moved, it had its moment, and she put it where she put everything else, in front of the arithmetic. A pound of ice for a burning man, sweet milk for a weaned baby. Numbers first, history after, and the numbers did not care whose gatepost the quarantine notice hung on. "Saddle fresh," she told Nils. "You'll carry a boiler of ice and the evening's milk to the Vic fence line. Set it on the stone wall, ring the bell, and stand off upwind while they carry it in. Every vessel that comes back gets scalded at my fire before it touches this hill. Doctor's rules, no exceptions, tell them so." He never pledged, Nils said. It was not an objection. He was 16, and he kept books in his head the whole Valley over, and he wanted to see how this page would be ruled. "Fever houses pay nothing," Maren said. "That's been the rule since the first day, and it doesn't have his name in it or mine. Rules you bend for enemies, you'll bend for friends, and then you haven't got rules, you've got moods. Go on now." She watched him take the road in the last light. Then she went in, opened the book, and wrote the Vic draw on the sick house page. Unpledged, unpriced, undebted, exactly like the Brekke page and the 2 others. If she felt anything as the pen crossed that name, the ledger, which is the only witness, records nothing but pounds. The hottest week of that summer began the last Sunday of July, and the valley kept its own private calendar of it ever afterward, the 7 days people meant when they said the worst of it. The heat those days was not weather. It was an occupation. Dust stood in the air from breakfast on and did not settle till midnight, so that the sun crossed the sky as a copper coin and lamps came lit at supper through windows the color of weak tea. Stock stood heads down in whatever shade held. Wells that had never failed drew up warm and cloudy, and the cloudiness was the dangerous part, and Kessler spent that whole week fighting it, because the cloudiness was where the fever lived. He held his one public lecture of the summer that Sunday on the schoolhouse steps after the service, and he held it with a bucket, a dipper, and a temper worn to the boards. This sickness is not in the air, he said. It's not in the night vapors, and it's not a judgment. It travels in water and in milk, out of one sick body and into the next, on hands and cups and cans, and every stretch of this creek runs past a barnyard before it runs past your dipper. You cannot see it, you cannot smell it, and sweet-tasting water kills as sure as foul. So you'll boil. Every drop that touches a lip or a milk can in this valley gets boiled first, a rolling boil, and I don't care that it's July and the stove's a torment. And every hand that nurses a sick body gets scalded and soaped before it touches food, a well rope, or a child. That's the whole sermon. The families that keep it will bury nobody, most of them. Boiled water in that heat was its own small torture, hot as tea and flat as rain barrel, and here the ice house wrote itself into the sanitation as neatly as into the milk. Boiled water, cooled on drawn ice, became the valley's drink that week, wagons hauling covered kettles up the rise at evening and home again cold. Children who could not be argued into drinking their medicine-tasting boiled ration drank it iced without complaint. Kessler called the trough the first public waterworks in the county's history, and only half his mouth smiled saying it. Marin spent the worst night of that week at the Breck place, because it was the week Anders Brecker's fever chose to make it stand, and Johanna. 11 days into nursing him alone, had reached the shore of what a body can do on no sleep. The sick-room work of that night deserves recording, because the same work filled 100 sick rooms that summer, and it is mostly gone from memory now. Anders lay burning, muttering, wasted to wire, in the dangerous place where the fever climbs at dark and the mind goes wandering after it. The two women worked him in shifts by lamplight. Cloths wrung out of the ice basin, laid to forehead, wrists, and ankles, lifted the moment they warmed, wrung again, laid again, an hour at a stretch, the rhythm of it as steady and dull as churning. A twist of ice and flannel behind the neck, the window shaded but cracked for air. Spoonfuls of cold-boiled water on the quarter hour, and near dawn, when the burning eased and he came half back to himself, cold milk by the spoonful too, the only supper his body had been able to hold for a week. "You count the spoons," Johanna said, low, across the bed. "Did Kessler tell you that part? You count everything. Spoons of milk, hours of sleep, days since the rash. Counting's the only prayer that talks back." "I keep books," Marin said. "It's the same religion." Somewhere in the gray of that morning, both of them wrung out and whispering across a sleeping man who was going to live, Johanna said the other thing, the thing Marin carried home and never entered in any ledger. "I hated you a little, you know. Last winter, hauling your sawdust past our place with your chin up like weather couldn't touch you. Anders said the ice would beat you by February, and I let him say it." Her hands kept working the cloth while she talked, wring, lay, lift, wring, and now every mouthful keeping him alive comes off your hill. I've been sitting here nights trying to make those two things fit in one head. They fit, Marin said. You watched a woman bet her shoes on a shed, and you called it the odds, same as the whole valley did. I'd have called it the same, Johanna, standing at your window. The difference was never sense. I'd already had my drowning. Sense comes cheaper after. That's a hard schoolhouse. It's the one that was open. Johanna laughed then, the cracked half-ounce of laugh that is all a sick room allows. And the two women were friends from that hour, in the manner of women who have wrung the same night's cloths, which is a manner that does not afterward come undone. The tally crew ran the daylight half of that same week, and it says something about the summer that the valley's children remembered it stubbornly as the best week of their lives. 6 of them rotated the stations Greta had drilled: gate slate, door tally, pounds drawn, drain walk, sawdust rake, scald kettle, self-important as railway clerks, cool as trout in the one cool yard in the county, while their elders wilted. Kirsten Brecky ran the pound column with her tongue between her teeth and caught the week's great scandal. A draw entered twice against the Roan page, and a correction stood in the book in her 11-year-old hand, initialed by the president herself. Marin paid the crew Saturdays, a penny each and a chip of ice the size of a fist, eaten straight in the shade of the north wall. Which pay they valued, Greta reported, well above the penny. And without one of them noticing it was happening, the whole apparatus of the system passed that week through their hands and into them. Door discipline, melt arithmetic, the sacredness of the written column, so that decades on, when those 6 ran farms and ledges of their own up and down the creek. The association never once had to teach its second generation its rules. They had eaten them cold at 11. The week broke on the following Sunday, not into rain, that mercy was still 5 weeks off, but into ordinary bearable heat, and the valley crawled out of it and counted. Every fever house on the creek had held. The milk had not soured, not one can, not one day. And the slate on the north door said the week had cost a full 1.5 tons of ice. The worst 7 days of melt and draw the stack had ever given up or ever would. Marin chalked the new balance Monday morning and stood looking at it while the drawing hour line watched her look. Then she wrote beneath the number the only editorial she ever added to that slate all summer. 4 words the valley repeated at fence lines for a month, half a joke and wholly a promise, the president's own verdict on the worst week. Cheaper than funerals. Hold, August was the month the valley learned what ice was actually for. Milk had built the system. Fever revealed it. Dr. Kessler climbed the rise the 2nd day of August, his first visit. Having heard from 3 kitchens about the widow's cold house, and he inspected the chamber as he would have inspected a wound, thoroughly and without small talk. Then he sat at Marin's table, drank the coffee she poured, and reorganized her stack in his head. "I can't cure typhoid," he said. "No one can. The medicine chest is nearly a lie, missus. I carry quinine because folks trust the bitterness. And it does its real work on ague, not this. What pulls a body through typhoid is 3 weeks of nursing done exactly right. And nursing runs on 3 supplies. Boiled water. Clean, sweet milk. It's the one food a typhoid gut can hold without tearing. And cold for the burning hours. He set the cup down. Water they can boil. Milk and cold in this drought exist in one building in this county, and I'm sitting in it. He taught the valley's women the burning hours work himself, and Marin had him teach it at the drawing hour so it spread in one telling. When the fever spiked past what a body could carry, you brought it down from outside. Cloths wrung in ice water to the head, the wrists, the ankles. Changed the moment they warmed. A twist of ice and flannel where the pulse ran near the skin. Sips of cold boiled water by the spoonful around the clock. It was not a cure, and he never called it one. It was a bridge. Hours bought at the worst of the burning, and a strong heart could cross 3 weeks on enough such hours. And the milk cold, always, he finished. Warm milk in a sick room in August is poisoned by noon, and a typhoid house has no spare luck. Small cans, drawn twice a day, kept on ice to the last minute. However you're pricing your ice, Mrs., price the sick rooms first. They're first, Marin said. They pay nothing. Then you're the best medicine in this county, Kessler said, and I include myself. The sick house runs became the summer's clockwork. 2 houses at first, then 4, then 6 as the fever crested, the Brecky place and the Vicks, and 4 along the lower creek. Every evening after the drawing hour, and every dawn before it, the wagon or Nils's horse went out with the boilers, ice and milk together, to fence lines and stone walls and gate posts, rung in with a bell, carried in by whoever inside could still walk. Every vessel came back to the scalding kettle. Greta kept a separate slate for the sick houses, and that slate alone, of all the slates in the valley, never showed a price. Johanna Brecker's husband Anders crossed his 3 weeks and lived. The Vic son's wife lay burning the longest of anyone on the creek, 11 days at the worst of it, and the Vic baby stayed sweet-fed and clear-eyed through all of it on twice-a-day milk drawn cold from a building its grandfather had called a monument to worry. Gunnar Vic came up the rise himself, once, at the height of it. He came on foot at the empty hour of the afternoon so that no one would see the visit, and Marin understood that and let it be. He stood in the yard, too proud to knock, too honest to leave, a big man gone gray in 1 month, and when she came out, he looked past her at the north door. "They tell me there's a page with my name on it," he said. "Nothing written in the price column." "Sick houses pay nothing," Marin said. "It's the first rule of the book. I know what I said in my doorway." His jaw worked. "I'll not have charity of you, of all the women alive." "Then don't call it charity," she said. "Call it the rule I'd have given any house on this creek, because it is. And if the word still chokes you, Gunnar, there's a cure. Come January, there'll be 100 tons wanted off that pond, and a man who owes no man can cut ice beside the rest of us and turn his page even. The pond doesn't know your history either. It's 14 inches of black ice, and it needs backs." He stood a long moment. Whatever war went on in him had no witnesses but the 2 of them and the building. "My grandfather cut peat in the old country," he said at last, which was as near to yes as the man's grammar reached. Then he turned and walked back down the hill, and Marin went in and ruled a January column onto the Vic page. And that was the whole of the famous reconciliation of Gunnar Vic. Exactly as it happened, no speech, no handshake, 1 column ruled in pencil. Understand what the book had become by then, because it was no longer a ledger of ice. Pledge by pledge, page by page, it had become the valley's own likeness. The first document in Sorrel Creek's history that showed the whole community as one working body. Who drew, who owed, who was sick, who hauled, who wardened the door on Thursdays. The circuit preacher, passing through in September, was shown it at the drawing hour with more reverence than the valley showed his Bible, and he said so, wryly, from the steps of the schoolhouse. But the number on the door slate did not care what the book had become. The last Monday of August, Maren chalked it and stood looking at what she had chalked. Under 2 tons. 19 farms' milk, 6 sick houses, and the hottest week of the summer still to burn, and beneath the yard of sawdust a stack that had filled a chamber to the rafters in February now stood waist-high in one corner bay, a gray-white remnant island in a floor of wet dark bedding. She had one private reserve left, and that week she spent it. Since the first day she had held back, unentered in any public column, a last half-ton against her own farm's need, the milk contract that would resume when the Creamery woke, the certified grade that was her one leverage on the future, her own family's page. Hold it, and her farm entered autumn armored no matter what the sky did. Spend it, and if the heat ran 2 weeks past the ledger's guess, the whole system died a week early with her name on the shortfall. She spent it as she did everything else in the open, chalked on the slate with the rest. When Kessler heard, he rode up to argue, "Doctor's arithmetic, keep your reserve, the strong point must hold." Maren heard him out with the book open in front of her. "If the sick houses run dry while I sit on a private half-ton, the system's dead anyway," she said. "Not the ice, the idea. Nobody pledges January labor to a woman who kept a bolt hole while their children burned. The reserve was never ice, Doctor. It was trust. And trust doesn't keep in sawdust. It keeps in the book, where everyone can read it." The rains broke on the 4th of September, 2 days before the ledger's line touched zero. They came the old way, a black afternoon wall out of the northwest, and the valley stood out in it in yards and lanes and stubble fields, faces up, while the drought washed off the county in one loud hour. The creek came back up its bed. The spring houses breathed cold again. The fever, which had been ebbing house by house since the last week of August, gave up its last quarantine gatepost by the equinox. In the ice house on the rise there remained, when the weather turned and the drawing hours ended, something under 400 pounds of it, one last low rank of blocks in the corner of the first bay, gray, rounded, sweated down to river stones. 18 tons had gone out the north door since June, and had come back as nothing the eye could see. No cash, no crop. Nothing but names and numbers in a widow's book and a valley's worth of living children. Maren did the season's last sums by lamplight, Greta asleep, the rain loud and wealthy on the roof. Then, at the foot of the pledge page, in the space where a merchant would have totaled his profit, she wrote the one line in all her books that ever leaned toward sentiment, and even it came out as accounting. "Paid in full to E.H.," she wrote. The building was never half finished. We were. The Creamery wagon came back up the valley road the 3rd Monday of September, and behind it, in his own buggy, came Mr. Dahl, and behind Dahl, figuratively speaking, came the Creamery's board of directors, whose minutes for that month record an item their clerk titled "The Sorrel Creek Cold Station Question." The wagon's return should have been the valley going back to normal, and on the surface it was. Cans at lane ends. Grading at the platform. Checks at the month's end, the first cash most families had seen since June. But the summer had rearranged something underneath the normal, and everyone on the route felt it without yet having words for it. 30 farms had spent a season learning that the wagon was not the system. The wagon was a wheel on the system. The system was cold, and the cold had one address, and it was not in Dunmore. The board had felt the rearrangement, too, from the other end, and boards translate feelings into offers. Doll laid this one on Marin's kitchen table the last Saturday of September in writing, with the seal at the bottom. The Creamery proposed to buy the Holt Ice House outright, building, trade, and goodwill. It would operate the place as a certified cold station of the Dunmore Creamery, install a paid keeper, cut its ice with hired crews, and guarantee cold storage to every contracted supplier on the North Route at a set fee per can. The price for the building was generous, and Doll did not pretend otherwise. It was a year of milk checks in one line. Set against a widow's ledger, it was the mortgage gone, the debts gone, shoes and schooling, and a margin against every winter for a decade. The board asked me what it would take to make the North Route drought-proof, Doll said. I told them the truth. I told them the North Route was the only piece of this county that already is, and we don't own the piece. This paper is the board agreeing with me. He turned the offer a quarter turn toward her, his old habit with his hat. I'll say the rest is your friend, not theirs. You're one woman on one hill, and this thing you've built is now a load-bearing wall for 30 families. That's a heavy thing to be. Missus, sell it, and it's a company's weight. Keep it, and it's yours, every August of your life. It was a fair offer, fairly argued, and this story would be poorer if it pretended the choice was easy, or that Marin treated it with contempt. She kept the paper 4 days. She walked the drain with it in her apron pocket. She covered its back with sums which Doll, if he ever saw, surely recognized as the family disease. What decided her was not loyalty and not grief and not even the pledges, though the pledges pressed. It was a flaw in the offer's arithmetic that she circled the second evening and could not uncircle. The Creamery would cut its ice with hired crews, cash labor, priced into the storage fee. Every family on the route would become, once again and forever, a customer, buying back at a fee the cold they had learned this summer to make with their own winters and their own backs. The system would survive. The knowledge would die. In 10 years, the valley would know how to pay for cold, and would have forgotten, as towns forget, how cold was made, and the next time the wagon stopped. For whatever stops wagons in the years ahead, the valley would stand at the bottom of the hill again, holding warm cans, waiting for a company to remember them. Against the offers page, in her own book, she wrote the counter arithmetic in one line. What they pay for, they lose. What they build, they keep. She gave Doll her answer at the schoolhouse because she asked for the meeting herself the first Saturday of October, and the whole valley came, which was itself the summer's measure. 2 years before, 8 men could not be found to raise her rafters. Now the benches were full and the walls were lined, Sorensen's and Breckus and Price down from town, Kessler in the back. And Gunnar Veek in the second row, with his arms crossed, attending, as he told his wife, strictly to see the numbers done honestly. Marin stood at the teacher's table with the book, the offer, and one blank sheet, and she was never remembered as an orator, because she was not one. She read the Creamery's offer aloud in full, fairly, including the price. She let the room have its murmur. Then she declined it in one sentence, thanked the board for the honor of it in a second, and turned the meeting to the blank sheet, which was the only reason she had called it. The building held 18 tons, and it wasn't enough, she said. You all watched the slate. 2 days of rain stood between this valley and the end of the ice, and I'll not gamble a second summer on the sky's good manners. Elias drew that chamber double for a reason I took 2 years to read. The reason was all of you. So here's what I'm proposing instead of the Creamery's paper, and it's the same trade I offered in June, made permanent, made bigger, and made yours." The proposal, as she laid it out and as the sheet recorded it, became the founding document of what the county register still lists as the Sorrel Creek Ice and Cold Storage Association. Every pledged family's January labor debt converted, at its holder's option, into a founding share. Shareholding families owned the association together: the ice, the tools, the trade, and the building itself, which Maren would deed over to the association at a valuation set not in cash but in shares, making her the largest single holder, but a holder among holders, outvotable on the books like everyone else. Shares paid no dividend in money. They paid in rights and duties recorded in the book, the right to storage by the can in proportion to holding. The duty of labor, days on the January ice, or days of hauling, wardening, sawdust, and repair, set by the same proportion. Families with cash and no spare backs could pay assessments toward tools and lumber. Families with backs and no cash, the Brecky position, as everyone understood without it being said, earned share upon share at the winter harvests. Sick houses, then and forever, drew free. The first rule of the old book carried whole into the new one. And one clause more, the one Maren argued for hardest, and the one that outlived them all. Every family taking a share bound itself to send one of its young, boy or girl, to the winter harvest and the summer wardening, to learn the whole system through the hands, cutting, packing, drainage, door discipline, and the keeping of the book. Knowledge held by one house, she told the room, had nearly died on this hill twice, once in a raft on the pond and once in a fever summer. The association's real stock was not ice. Ice melted every year on schedule. The stock was the knowing, and the knowing had to be banked in every family on the creek, or the whole enterprise was one bad winter from an empty building. The room voted with its feet, family by family, walking up to the teacher's table to sign, and the sheet filled top to bottom while the lamps burned down. 22 names the first night. Lars Sorensen signed first, having earned it. Johanna Brecky signed for her house with Anders still too weak to hold the pen steady, and signed the labor column and looked up while she did it, daring anyone in the room to remark on it. Nobody did. Gunnar Vik came up last, as he had plainly planned to, and stood over the sheet, and the room went carefully about its business of not watching him. "I said once that I owe no man," he announced to the sheet at large. "I've had a summer to price that sentence." He signed in the big square hand of his generation and laid down the pen and looked at Maren. "Well, now I owe everyone. I'm told that's called a community." It was the closest thing to a joke the man had ever been caught making, and the schoolhouse laughed less at the wit than at the surrender, and Vic himself came as near to smiling as his face's construction allowed. Dahl, standing at the back with his declined offer folded in his coat, laughed with him, then came forward, shook Maren's hand, and asked the association's founding meeting for the Creamery's first contract, certified cold storage for the North Route, at a fee payable in cash to the shareholders' account. "You came to buy the wall," Maren said, "and you'll rent it instead." "Missus," said Dahl, "I'll tell the board it was the best wall in the county and not for sale. They'll want to know what it cost." He glanced at the sheet full of names. "I'll tell them the truth. 2 winters and a fever summer, and every dollar of it paid in the one coin they can't print. Autumn that year was the association learning to be one, and it learned as the valley learned everything through work and argument in that order. The first work was lumber. 18 tons had failed the summer, and the founding meeting had voted the capacity doubled before it voted anything else. Through October and November, a second chamber rose against the first, sharing its north wall, built to the pencil, double-sided, sawdust-filled, gravel-floored, cupola-vented, and this time the raising took one day, because 60 hands came. Marin stood in the yard that morning and watched wagons turn up her lane from both directions, and if any single hour repaid the 2 years, the valley agreed afterward, it was that one. The frame that had cost one man his life and one woman 2 winters went up its second bay between breakfast and dark, with dinner at noon for all hands, Johanna Brecker presiding over the kettles like a marshal. Price sold the association its own iron at cost, saws, plows, bars, tongs, and creepers for a full crew, and threw in his July fee for good on the argument, which he made publicly at the store, that competition disorganized was better joined than fought. He took a share for it and became the association's town agent, cold storage by the pound for the butcher trade. Cash to the shareholders' account. Margins, he reminded Marin at the signing, are what businesses are made of. It was a smaller lesson than hers, but it was true too, and the account grew on it all the next decade. The arguments were smaller than the work, but they taught more, and Marin let them run. Because a book that only one person believes in is a diary, and she meant this one to be a government. The Valley argued the storage schedule, the warden roster, the sick house rule, whether shares could be sold outside the creek, which was settled no, and whether the children's training clause really meant girls, which was settled yes, by the votes of every woman who had spent August wringing ice cloths at a burning bedside, while the theory of what women could learn was elsewhere, unhelpfully. Being warm. Each settled argument went into the book in plain words, and the book itself got a Constitution's dignity. 2 copies now, one at the ice house and one at the schoolhouse. Kirsten Brecky and Greta trading months as clerks. Rules you bend for friends or moods, the widow's line from the fever summer, was written on the inside cover of both copies. And generations of Searle Creek children learned their round hand copying the association's minutes under it. What changed for Marin herself that autumn was quieter, and she would have been the last to narrate it, so the narration falls to the record. The County Agricultural Society, which had never once driven up her lane, wrote to ask for a paper on farm cold storage, to be read at the Winter Institute. Dahl's board minuted her by name as the association's president, the first woman so entered in that county. And at the schoolhouse, where the Valley's affairs had always been settled by the same 5 or 6 weathered men at the same table, a 7th chair simply began to be set out without discussion, and the Valley's business, roads, the school term. The church stove, the spring seed order, stopped being settlable until the widow Holt had looked at the arithmetic. She took the chair when she had time, and sent Greta with the book when she had not, and the Valley learned to accept the book as her proxy, which amused Kessler without end. "They used to leave you off the list of people," he said, riding beside her wagon one November evening. "Now you're on it twice, once as a woman and once as an institution." "The institution keeps better hours," Marin said. The winter's plan, chalked and argued and entered through November, was the old private harvest scaled to a commonwealth. 100 tons wanted, both chambers full, against a drought summer and a Creamery contract and Price's town trade, and a margin over all of it. Because the plan now planned for the plan failing, which Marin counted the one real lesson of the fever summer. 14 days of cutting weather permitting, beginning when the auger showed 14 honest inches out where the pond ran deepest. A crew of 40 pledged and rostered cutters, breakers, floaters, ramp men, teamsters, stackers, packers, and a kitchen detail with a children's training clause, putting a dozen of the valley's young on the ice in rotation, each one bound to work every station before spring. Every family's days were priced and posted. Every station had a warden. Every rule that 2 winters of lonely work had written into one woman's habits was now written where 100 people could read it. Test before you trust. Clear before you mark. Mark before you cut. Never stand on the piece you are cutting free. Sound ice talks, silent ice kills. The cheapest thing on the pond is the ice you walk away from. Marin read the roster the night it was finished. 40 names ruled fair in the clerk's round hand, and sat back and found herself, for the first time in 3 winters, with nothing to carry alone. The sensation, she told Johanna, was like setting down a yoke you had stopped feeling, and discovering by the ache exactly what it had weighed. You could rest, Johanna said. The valley owes you rest, whatever the book says. The book says the ice comes first to the one who tests it, Marin said. That's still my station. It was Elias's, and it's mine, and one day it'll be Greta's, and whoever holds it walks out first and alone. Everything else on that pond got shared. That part doesn't share. That part is what the shares stand on. December ran cold and dry, the pond froze early and black, and the whole valley, that year and every year after, found itself watching the ice as it had once watched only the wheat, as a crop, as money, as the winter's harvest ripening in the dark under the snow. Children auger tested the shallows for sport and reported depths at the store like market prices. Gunner Vic, encountered at the blacksmith's, was heard to pronounce the freeze a fine one. 14 inches by the new year, or he was a Dutchman, and to say the words "our harvest" without apparent awareness of any change in his grammar. On the feast of the Epiphany, Marin Holt walked out onto the deep water alone, as the rule required, with the auger over her shoulder and her creepers biting. Out over the place that had taken her husband and given the valley its living, and bored her test holes rod by rod, and measured and stood up in the low gold morning and waved her arm at the shore. 15 inches, black as bottled glass, from the north bank to the cutting field. The harvest was called for the following Monday. The bell at the schoolhouse rang it, 3 strokes and 3, the association's own signal, agreed in the book. No bell in Sorrel Creek had ever rung for work before, only for worship or death, and nobody who heard it ever forgot that it sounded, on the cold air, exactly like the other 2, which, Kessler observed, was fitting, since it was calling the valley to both. They came up the pond road in the blue dark before 6. Wagon after wagon, lanterns swinging, breath standing over the teams like second horses. 40 people stood on the ice of Sorrel Creek Pond that Monday morning, on the deep water, over the drowned raft, and the low sun came over the trees and lit a cutting field already scraped, already gridded. The great gray quilt stitched onto the pond 100 squares wide. It went, the old hands agreed forever after, like a barn raising and a threshing, and a church supper rolled into one and frozen. The long saws worked in pairs down the scored lanes, 12 strokes and rest, the crews changing on the warden's call so no back wore out before dinner. The breaker bars walked the cross lines, and the blocks cracked off the sheet clean along the score. Geometry doing what strength never could, and the channel ran full all day. Blue-white barges poled in file toward the ramp like the freight of a very small, very rich harbor. At the ramp, the teams took the ropes, and the blocks came surging up the wet planks, trailing steam onto the sledges, up the rise, through the north doors of both chambers, where the stackers laid their courses level as masonry, and the packing crews rammed the sawdust home, wall to ice, course by course, the tamping poles thudding all day like slow drums. Johanna Brecke's kitchen detail served dinner in the yard to 40 at noon, stew and bread and coffee that smoked like the ice, and the children of the training claws rotated station to station with their mittened hands and their orders, learning through the palms what no circular could teach. Nils Sørensen, 18 now and a founding warden, ran the ramp. Gunnar Vick cut in the first pair of saws the whole first day, silent, tireless, turning his page even stroke by stroke exactly as promised, and at day's end, sweat frozen in his beard, pronounced ice-cutting easier than Pete, and nobody believed him, and he knew it. Kessler drove out at midday, officially to watch for frostbite, actually to stand on the shore with his hands behind his back, looking at 40 people harvesting cold, and what he said there got written by Kirsten in the margin of the day's tally, because clerks in that valley had learned whose sentences to keep. 2 winters ago this pond was where the valley's luck drowned, he said. Look at it now. Same water, same cold. All that changed was what they know. And at the center of it, all 14 days, moved a woman of 33 in a man's wool coat, auburn braid pinned under a knit cap, freckles bleached by the winter light, creepers on her boots. She tested every morning's ice before any boot followed hers. She called the weather, moved the field off the deep water the one soft afternoon, and gave away 11 blocks to caution without blinking. She settled the small quarrels, priced the days, taught the saw to anyone who asked, and was addressed by every soul on the pond down to the youngest tally child, not as the widow Holt, but as the president, which the valley had shortened by February, without anyone deciding it, to plain Mrs. President, a title the county came to know within the decade. The tally, that first association winter, closed at 106 tons, both chambers full to the rafters, packed, blanketed, barred, the largest store of coal between Dunmore and the county line, owned by no company and no Lone Hill farm, but by 29 families in written shares, each share a winter's work, each winter's work a summer's safety. The Creamery's contract was served out of the first chamber all the following season at full grade every day of it. Price's town trade drew from the second. The sick house rule stood at the head of the book and was drawn on twice that August, gratis, without a meeting, because rules that don't bend are the only ones worth writing. The system outlived everyone in this story. That is not a figure of speech. The county register carries the association's minutes in an unbroken run for 2 generations. Drought summers and fever scares and rail strikes and bank panics, the shares passing down farm to farm, the training claws filling the January ice with each new crop of children until the age of machine cold arrived and the last harvest was cut. By then, mostly for ceremony, by the grandchildren of the founders. The building stood past all of it, and the drain still ran clear, because somebody walked it every week to the end, 10 minutes a day, every day, without fail. Systems die of Tuesdays. Theirs was never allowed to. But the ending that belongs to this story is smaller than all that. And earlier. It is the last hour of the first harvest's last day. the light going amber and long across the pond, the final sledge creaking up the rise, the crews unbending their backs by the shore fires. Marin waited at the north door as the last block of the 106 tons came up the planks, and she set her mittened hand flat on it as it passed the sill. The same gesture she had made alone at that door 2 winters before, when the tally was 1 book, 1 child's pencil, and 182 blocks nobody wanted. Beside her in the doorway stood Greta, 12 now, tall as her mother's shoulder, with the association's book held open against her chest in the cold, keeping the count exactly as she had kept it when the count was a family's secret liturgy. She entered the last block, ran her column, and looked up. "That's all of it," she said. "Both chambers. It's more than the page can hold, Mama. I'll need to rule a bigger book." Marin looked out from the doorway, down the trampled silver of the rise, at the pond covered with her neighbors, at the lanterns coming alight one by one along the shore where wagons were loading tired children into hay and blankets, at the whole warm human noise of it rising off the ice that had once held only one man's silence. Winter lay folded and waiting at her back, 100 tons of January addressed and posted to August, to the milk, to the medicine, to whatever summer meant to try next. Cold as a crop. The valley had learned it. The book would remember it. The children would carry it. "Rule the bigger book," she said, and drew the north door shut and set the bar in its brackets, and walked down the hill through the lantern light to help load the last of the wagons, one neighbor among many going home.